Now that we have our core app created, we can go ahead and actually add our wait4db command. So creating custom Django management commands is documented in the official documentation of Django. I'm going to walk you through how to create a basic command that we're going to use for our wait4db command. So the first thing we need to do is inside the core app, we're going to create a new directory, and that is going to be called management. And then inside that management directory, we're going to create an init.py. And inside the management directory, we're going to create another directory called commands. And inside that, we're also going to create an init.py. And then inside commands, level with init.py, we're going to add the name of the command, which is wait_for_db.py. So because of this database, or because of this directory structure, Django will automatically detect this as a management command that it will then allow us to run using python manage.py. So at the top of the wait4db command, we're going to add a comment here. So we're going to say Django command to wait for the database to be available. And then we're going to type from django.core.management.base import base command, and then class command base command, and then a Django command to wait for database. And then below that, we're going to do def handle self args and options. And we'll just put pass there for now. Okay, so save the file. This is basically a simple empty stub that we can use for creating our command. So this is the minimum code that you need for adding a Django management command. If you were to actually run the wait4db command, it would probably execute because it wouldn't actually do anything, but it would still run the command because we've created it in the correct structure. But as we do with test-driven development, before we write any more code here, we're going to go ahead and add a unit test for our command, and then we're going to make sure that test fails, and then we're going to actually implement the command. So let's add the unit test. We're going to create a new file inside tests inside our core app, and that's going to be called test_commands.py. Then at the top of the file, I'm going to add docstring here, test custom Django management commands, and we'll do from unit test.mock import patch, and then from scopg2 import operational error as scopg2 error. I'm just going to go through the code and then I'll explain it after we've written the bulk of the code. We'll do from django.core.management import call_command from django.db.utils import operational error, and then from django.test import simple test case. Okay, so what this is basically going to do is it's going to add the imports that we need, and the imports are patch. In order to mock behavior, we're going to mock the behavior of the database because we need to be able to simulate when the database is returning a response or not. And then we have this operational error exception, which we import from scopg2. It's one of the possibilities of the errors that we might get when we try and connect to the database before the database is ready. Then we have the call command, which is a helper function provided by Django that allows us to simulate or to actually call a command by the name. And this allows us to actually call the command that we're testing. And then we have another operational error, which is another exception that may get thrown by the database depending on what stage of the startup process it is in. We basically want to cover both options. And then we have simple test case, which is the base test class that we're going to use for testing our unit test or creating our unit test. And it's important that we use simple test case because we are testing behavior that the database is not available, and therefore we do not need migrations and things like that to be applied to the test database, because we're just actually simulating behavior of that database. So we're just going to use simple test case so it doesn't create any database setup and things like that behind the scenes. Okay, so now let's add the code for our test. We'll do class command tests, and we'll base from simple test case. Add the docstring test commands. And then we'll do def test wait for DB ready. Self. And this will be test waiting for database if database ready. So this is one possible test case, is that we run the wait for DB command and the database is already ready. So we don't want it to do anything. We just want it to continue and allow us to get on with the execution of our application. So to do this, we need to mock the behavior of our database. So we're going to mock that behavior by doing @patch, and we're going to do it for all the different test methods. So that's why we're putting the patch decorator here at the top of commands tests. So we'll do patch and then core.management.commands.wait for db.command with a capital C .check. So this is basically the command that we're going to be mocking. So we've provided the path here, which is core.management.commands.wait for db. And this is because we're going to actually be using the command.check, which is provided by the command base class. So the base command here, it has a check method that allows us to check the status of the database. And we're going to be mocking that check method to simulate the response. So we can simulate that check method returning an exception or throwing an exception, and we can also simulate it returning a value. So because we've added patch here, it's going to add a new argument to each of the calls that we make to our test methods. So we need to catch that here, or we need to define, I should say, define the parameter as patched_check. So the patched check object, the magic mock object that is replaced, or that replaces check by patch, is going to be passed in as an argument here to our patched check parameter. And then we can use that to customize the behavior. So what we're going to do is we're going to set patched_check.return_value equals true. And this just says when we call check, or when check is called inside our command, inside our test case, we just want it to return the true value. We don't want it to do anything else, just simply return a value. So now what we can do is use call command, and we'll call the wait_for db command, and this will actually execute the code inside wait for db. And of course, we are also checking here that the command actually gets called, because if we don't have the command and we try and call command, then we're going to get an error. So this kind of tests two things. It tests the situation where the database is ready and we run the command, also checks that the command is set up correctly and can be called inside our Django project. Now what we want to do is simply check that this check method has been called. So we'll do patched_check.assert_called_once_with databases, and we want to check the default database. So this basically ensures that the mocked value here, the mocked object, which is the check method inside our command, is called with these parameters. So this test just basically checks that we're calling the right thing from our wait for db ready. Okay, if you save that, and now let's just go ahead and run the tests. So we'll do docker compose run rm app sh-c manage.py test, and this will tell us if we've have any errors or anything. So docker compose, I put an extra p. So we're basically just seeing if I had any typos or anything as I was going. So it looks like it worked successfully. It said error, expected check to be called once, called 0 times. And of course it's been called 0 times because we haven't implemented that code yet. But this basically tells me that the kind of command stub that we set up seems to be working okay, and also the basic test setup here seems to be working okay. So now we can move on to the second test case, and that is testing what happens or what should happen if the database isn't ready. So this means the database returns some exceptions, or the check method returns some exceptions that indicate that the database isn't ready yet. So we want to test the behavior that happens when we do that. So let's add another test method here, df test underscore wait for db delay. So this is when there's a delay in starting. We want to simply check if the database is ready. The database isn't ready, so we want it to delay a few seconds and try again. So we'll pass in self and then patched underscore check. Colon, we'll add the doc string here. Test waiting for database when getting operational error. Okay, and now what we're going to do is patched underscore check dot side effect equals psycopg2 error times 2 plus, and then a backslash here, operational error times 3 plus true. Okay, so this might be a bit confusing here because this is how the mocking works when you want to raise an exception. So when you're mocking an object, like we've mocked the check object here, which is the method check, what we do here in the first case on line 19 is we just simply return the value true. So for that test, we just make it return the value true. But for the second test that we define down here, we want it to actually raise some exceptions that would be raised if the database wasn't ready. So the way that you make it raise an exception instead of actually returning a value is you use the side effect. So the side effect allows you to pass in various different items that get handled differently depending on their type. So if we pass in an exception, then the mocking library knows that it should raise that exception. If we pass in a Boolean, then it will return the Boolean value. So what this allows us to do is define various different values that happen each time we call it in the order that we call it. So it's a little bit confusing, but if you bear with me, it should make sense. Basically, what we're doing here is we're saying the first 2 times, so that's why we have the times 2 here, the first 2 times we call the mocked method, we want it to raise the psycopg2 error. So it raises the error. And then this is just the syntax to break this onto a different line here. You could just as easily do it on one line, but I like to keep my lines within a certain line length. Then what we do is we raise 3 operational errors. So the first 2 times we raise the psycopg2 error, and the next 3 times we raise operational error. And what I found with trial and error with using this and developing this feature is that often what happens is there's different stages of Postgres starting. The first stage is Postgres, the application itself hasn't even started yet, so it's not ready to accept any connections. In that case, you get this psycopg2 error, which is raised from the psycopg2 package. And then after that, the database is ready to accept connections, but it hasn't set up the testing database that we want to use. So it hasn't actually created the dev database that we want to use. In that case, Django raises the operational error from Django's exceptions. So it's 2 different exceptions named the same thing, and we basically want to catch both of them. So in this case, I'm simulating the first 2 times you call it, return psycopg2 error, and the next 3 times it will return the operational error. Now these are just arbitrary values. I'm doing this because 2 and 3 are just different values. They seem to make sense in terms of like roughly what you would experience in a real situation. You could easily change this to 10 or 3 or 10 or 7, like whichever different number of exceptions you want to test being returned. I'm going to leave it for 2 and 3 because that seems to me like a realistic number that you would get when you're first starting the database. Finally, we add true here, which means the 6th time we call it, we're going to get true back. So it's just going to return true. And it just knows, because it's not an exception value, that it should return the value instead of raising it as an exception. Okay, so now that that mocking is set up, we can call the command by typing call underscore command, wait for DB, and then we're going to add our assertion. So the first thing we want to check is that self.assert equal patched check.call underscore count is equal to 6. So because we are raising the first 2 exceptions and then 3 more exceptions, and then the 6th time we're returning a value, we would expect it to only call the check method 6 times because it keeps calling it over and over again until it gets true. So if it's any more than 6, that means we called it an additional time. That wasn't necessary. If it's any less than 6, then we're not checking the exceptions properly in the test. So we're going to call it 6 times, and we're going to make sure in our assertion here that the call count of the mocked check method was called 6 times. Now we'll do patch underscore check dot assert called with databases equals default. So this, very similar to this line here, just make sure that it is called with the correct values. So let's just see, it should be called, called with, because it's not going to be called once, it's going to be called multiple times. So we're basically checking here that, I think I have a typo here, so database, it should just be database, not databases. These two should match here. So we're basically making sure that the patch checked is being called with database equals default. So that's the basic parameters that we're going to pass to the check method. Okay, so that's all we need to do. Actually, it's not all we need to do, there's one more thing. Okay, so the last thing we need to do for this test case is we need to mock the sleep method. So what's going to happen is we're going to actually be checking the database and then calling something called sleep, which will wait for the set period of time before we check again, because we don't want to just make thousands of requests to the database while it's trying to start. We want to check the database, wait a few seconds, and then check again. However, we don't want to wait in the test. So we don't want to actually wait in our unit test because that's just going to slow our tests down. So what we can do is we can add another patch here, this time on the actual method, because we only need this patch to apply to this particular test method. We'll type patch time.sleep, and then we will add patched underscore sleep, comma. Now, it's important that you create these different arguments in the correct order, because the way that it works, and it isn't really clearly defined anywhere, although I'm sure if you do look through the Python unit test documentation, you will probably find it. But the way it works is it applies the arguments from the inside out. So this argument here is the first argument, and this argument here is the second. And the more you add on top, the more it adds to the end here. So if you were to add another one of these here, then that would be patched sleep 2, for example, and you can keep patching all the things you need to patch for your unit test, and they get added from the inside out. So that's just one little thing to keep note of. Now we only need to patch this once, you don't want to do it twice, so we will just delete that. And all this will do is it will replace the sleep function, that's the built-in sleep function, with just a magic mock object. So all this does is it is an object that will just return, I think it just returns a non-value every time you call it. The important thing is that we're mocking we're overriding the behavior of sleep so that it doesn't actually wait and force us to pause the execution of our unit tests. It will just continue the execution of our code. For the purpose of the unit test, it will just pass through immediately and it won't hold up our test execution. Okay, so you can save the file. Now if we go back to terminal, you can go ahead and you can run the test again, and they should fail because we haven't implemented it yet. And yeah, you can see it failed on the number of times it was called. It was called 0 instead of 6, and it was expected that check would be called once. So now we have our unit test working. We can move on to the next lesson where we're actually going to create our wait for DB command.